Welcome to Season 6 of the Photo Ethics Podcast. I'm your host, Savannah Dodd, and I'm the founder of the Photography Ethics Center. Each week, I'll be talking with an accomplished photographer about the ethics of their practice. This episode of the Photo Ethics Podcast is brought to you by Falmouth University, one of the UK's leading creative arts institutions. If you're a regular listener, you'll know that I'm passionate about education, especially education that is accessible. With flexible online learning through Falmouth University, you can study from anywhere, starting in January, May, or September. Join the university that has nurtured the award-winning photographers Justin Carey, who we interviewed in Season 1, and Rehab El-Dalil, who we interviewed in Season 4. Falmouth graduates have been featured in the New York Times, The Guardian, and the BBC. If you're passionate about photography and want to refine your practice, Falmouth's specialist photography courses are designed for you. Led by expert academics and industry-savvy tutors, you'll develop your critical thinking and create work that explores powerful themes on a local, national, and international scale. Search Photography at Falmouth to find out more. Today, in the 12th and final episode of Season 6, we'll be talking with Tanya Habjouqa on reevaluation and responsibility. Tanya Habjouqa is a documentary photographer and educator, known for blending an intuitive sense of metaphor with investigations into community trauma and dispossession. Her artistic practice links collaborative portraiture, gender, representations of otherness, and human rights with a mordant sense of irony. Born in Amman to a Circassian father and Texan mother, the Circassian genocide and subsequent sanctuary in Jordan influenced her work. Her first monograph, Occupied Pleasures, was published in 2015 and heralded by Time magazine and the Smithsonian as one of the best photo books of that year, the project winning a World Press Photo Award in 2014. Tanya is a founding mentor in the Arab documentary program, nurturing marginalized narratives and photographers from the Middle East and North Africa for over a decade. She has worked as a freelance photographer for the Wall Street Journal, NPR, Le Monde, National Geographic, The New Yorker, and The Washington Post. Represented by East Wing Gallery, she is currently teaching and securing her second master's and MFA at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, researching artist books, print and paper making, cartonera, archive, and documentary theater. Can we just start with you telling us a little bit about the kind of work that you do?
I need to care about the community that I am photographing when it comes to my personal work. There's a difference between my journalistic work and my personal work. So what I'm very passionate about is in my own documentary work. If I move to a place and I have no connection, I have very little interest in telling. I need to feel a connection. I need to have a spark. So my personal work is quite often geopolitically driven. It has a lot to do with autonomy, rights, basic humanity. That sounds like big themes to throw out at the onset, but I was always driven by that passion. And in recent years, I came full circle to realize that I think it has to do with my own family's history as Circassians. We were genocided and practically wiped off the earth. And those that remain are over 90% diaspora around the world. And I think that was actually my interest, is here I am, a storyteller. Here I am, a documentarian, researching anthropologist, trying to find ways to catch traces and make people care. And I think that it's driven perhaps from the fact that nobody knows who we are and nobody told our story well enough.
That's really interesting. And have you done work on your own community background?
I'm half Jordanian and half Texan. And I was raised between both places. In Jordan, we're such a small part. We're a boisterous part of the community, but we're like 2% of the population. And we've been so removed from our own lands and being that there's a few dishes. There's a beautiful array of dances, stunning dances and folkloric costumes. But getting closer beyond that, like the visuals when I was younger, especially at the beginning of photojournalism, were very limited, mostly dancers or teen dancers getting into costume. And that didn't interest me because I felt it was just too much the surface. And in the back of my mind, I've been thinking, how can I? And now over the decades of experimenting and getting access to stories that are nearly impossible to tell, I feel better equipped to do it. I don't know at this stage geopolitically if I'll get access to the homeland. And I also don't have to, I can go through the diasporic communities. So I will be telling that. And interestingly, recently I found the spark. I always need to have the spark. It has to be this intellectual, like a clue. Oh, this is a way I can tell this impossible story. And I was feeling very depressed, having moved around 9 months out of Palestine and to the deep American Midwest in Madison, Wisconsin. I was researching their historical archives, and I found a Circassian circus beauty. And I was like, what the hell is that? And the woman didn't have her features and had this giant mop of permed curls trailing down below her waist. And it was absurd. And I started to research, and it turned out that there were fake Circassian women put into Barnum and Bailey's circus as a sort of a sideshow. And I started to dig further, and Sarah Lewis, an academic from Harvard, just put out a book on race construction in America and unpacking it. And fascinatingly, Circassians, no one knows who we are. No one, it played a major role in the construction of race in America because during the Russo-Caucasus Wars, it overlapped with the Civil War in the US. And interestingly, the Southerners saw themselves as those being oppressed by as the Caucasus, right? They saw empire coming and taking, and they made these sort of false equivalencies, and in their mind, white. And then there was also the side gift of these, like, of the news reporting the battles and romanticizing it and talking about beautiful women being taken to Turkish harems. So it fed into this fantasy that was utilized in its sort of war cry in the South. And it turns out that so at the same time in real, like Frederick Douglass and such characters were decoding that and saying, you're actually talking about an oppressed indigenous people, a brown people, a Muslim people who have been displaced to, and he utilized the name Arabia at the time, right? And so there's just, I guess now that I'm in this quiet, now that I'm out of the intensity, I'm having time to kind of think and find these cyclical links of diaspora and racism. And that story that prompted me in my own childhood, I'm starting to finally understand it, unpack, and find ways perhaps to tell it, utilizing some of the new processes I'm learning at this university.
No, that's super interesting to hear. Yeah, about all those connections. You mentioned just now about, the different processes that you're learning in the MFA program that you're doing now. Could you tell us a little bit about what those processes are and how that shapes maybe how you're thinking about photography or thinking about your work?
I have a master's actually from the UK, from SOAS, and that was amazing for radical reconstructions and thinking and improvements in writing and kind of rejection of mainstream narratives. And then I discovered in the US that the MA is not considered terminal. So it's very difficult to get teaching positions in universities with just an MA. So I've come to I was being headhunted for years by a really passionate professor and documentary photographer, Darcy Padilla, And she always said, Tanya, it's time. And she was like, this industry leaning towards the Western legacy paper hiring industry of documentary photographers. She said, this industry ages women out. And it was always in the back of my mind. And when things were quite dire economically in our field, and have been, and it's very difficult to survive as a documentary photographer. And I was making considerations the summer before last about applying, and I went to New York to brainstorm. I was trying to work towards an application for a Guggenheim, but I was exhausted. I was exhausted mentally and physically because I've been battling for over a decade my residency right, my right to remain with my family in Palestine. And I was exhausted from every inch of my money that I was hardly making because there was hardly any work for several years in Palestine. It was every month or so an assignment. And I was I think I was exhausted by just the sheer amount of gathering of pain and testimony and just cruelty. And I was coming back with the decision that it was time to leave. I think I was ready. I knew that I needed to regenerate, that I wasn't going to be okay if I stayed. And by chance, I came back that September, and a few weeks later, October 7th happened. And everything, it was just, I won't forget the moment that I heard, that I got chills up the backs of my arms. I still remember the physical sensation. And I knew then, oh God, this is going to be something irrevocable. This is going to be something we haven't seen. And it was just the somberness. And at that point, everything went into hyperdrive. And I'll pause here because we can circle back at your prompt. I'll categorically come back to your initial question.
That's fine. You can take it whatever direction you want.
I knew, because I was so upset and dissatisfied with so many things that were happening and how that story was being framed and told in my role. And there were some amazing editors that I had, and there were things that happened behind the scenes, but there was a lot of disappointments, and I had to question what my role was. And so at that time, I was like, I'm going to miss my opportunity to apply. And Darcy Padilla called me a couple days before the deadline and was like, well, did you apply? And I said, no. I said, I'm photographing from, 8 a.m. until 1 a.m. and then editing. I'm like, I don't have time. I'm not in the headspace to do this. And she was like, just, she's a very strong character. Just do it. And I was like, Darcy, I don't even have the documents from the UK, and bureaucracy is slow there. I'm not going to be able to do this. And she very emphatically, she has a way with words. I'm not going to repeat them here, but slammed the phone down, and I did it. I think I pulled an all-nighter applying, and I begged SOAS and explained the situation of what we were working with, how we were operating, the journalists, and I managed to get in. And the very long-winded answer to your question is, once I came here to this MFA program in this Midwest, it's very beautiful. It's very comfortable. It's also very white. It's very homogenous in a lot of ways, this place. And I thought I'd made a mistake. I was like, oh my God, what the hell? I was there. I was in the middle trying to shape history. I was trying, and I don't mean to sound, it's not ego. It's like you feel this responsibility, this ethical responsibility. And I was like, what can photography even say to me right now? What am I going to study in this MFA? And then who knew that a couple of months later, Palestine was going to become a front and center issue. The Palestine issue that for so long I have dedicated myself to telling and trying to tell, that was always pushed to the side, and Palestine didn't matter. And now it is becoming one of the forefront issues in the United States. And so all of this is happening, and I'm unpacking this in the university, and I'm trying to find, like, what do I want to, I don't want to photograph here. I don't feel any connection. What am I going to photograph? I need to care about the community that I'm photographing. There needs to be a stake, a personal stake. It was then that I started to take printmaking and photo intaglio and having a physical stake. The printmaking takes it a whole other physical level of connecting with the image. And there was a healing in that. And it was a moment where I had an image of, because I didn't know printmaking, I've never taken an art class. And I was very intimidated because everyone is, sculptors, and, it's a multidisciplinary art program. And I took an image that I would never use in my documentary work, mostly because it's low res. It was on my iPhone, but you were able to take this low res image, burn it onto a plate. And it was an image of my daughter. And we'd been hiking in a 1948 village that had been forcibly depopulated. And she'd found these giant, almost Alice in Wonderland, like pomegranates. And she's holding them. And there's this somber look on her face. And I was, again, feeling guilt for this move. And so I was sort of pulling the ink down over the plate. And I was being a perfectionist. I was, ink, and I was nervous. And the professor came up and said, I'm going to push the photographer out of you, the perfectionist. You need to be here in the moment. Grab the end, just physically feel it and pull that ink and connect. And there was something healing about that process. But it was also just, wow, I can take a faint archival picture. I can utilize images that I could not in our traditional photography realm. And then discovered artist books. And artist books were a whole other realm. And I discovered Maureen Cummings. She would get access into these archives and then unpack them and bring them into the world in a completely new and imaginative way, where you're interacting with the book with a physicality, but a physicality that's letting you take in the information, and you're able to layer in a way that a traditional photo essay cannot. No matter how much you try, no matter how nuanced the captions, you were able to layer in a way. And that thrilled me. It was this moment where I understood I was in a position where I could bring my documentary work and ethics behind that, but find new ways of layering, bringing in history and overlaying texts. And the final thing I'll say about that is the artist books, the artist book movement, and some of the innovators behind it. One of the innovators used to teach on campus here. Yeah, so Walter Hamady said that the artist book was the ultimate Trojan horse of ideas, because, you're making these sheer delights, these books that you have to encounter with a tactile urgency, and this layering of information is very specific. And the way they're playing with image and text is a whole other ballgame. And that idea thrilled me, because I always felt like I was having to do that in my work from Palestine, ninja away, put colors and pleasure to talk about the pain, because people didn't want to talk about the Palestine pain. So, yeah.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. I mean, something that you just said there reminds me a little bit of photographer and artist Sean Hillen, and he's from Northern Ireland, and he went to study at the Slade in London and took with him all of his photographs from the Troubles in Northern Ireland. But he found that people didn't want to look at them, right? They didn't want to look at because they'd seen so much of the Troubles in Northern Ireland in the newspaper. So instead, he started to create fantastical collages to try to draw people in. So it sort of reminds me of a very similar idea of that sort of Trojan horse way of getting a topic in front of people, getting people to engage with something when their inclination might be to turn off to it.
I mean, that's exactly it. And sometimes overlinking such hurdles brings you to a sort of a creative aha moment to create something new. But I would share with my students in the Arab documentary photo program is like, oh, you can't get physical access, or, oh, this narrative is being dismissed. Find a sneaky way to bring it to the forefront. A lot of us across the greater Middle East, from North Africa, the Levant to the Gulf, are working in systems of either direct occupation or sometimes repressive governments. You have to find mischievous, sneaky ways to bring those narratives to the forefront. I'm going to sound a bit controversial. As someone who I love journalism. It's an essential role in our lives. It's problematic covering Palestine and the occupation. It's not lived up to what it's needed to do there, but I don't want to in any way, shape, or form sound like I'm shitting on photojournalism. It's an essential role in our lives. But I found that a lot of the photographers, the younger ones that I was working with, either, again, direct politically charged environments where it was not safe to photograph, but there was a different element sometimes at play, which I would almost call a colonial oppression of Western photojournalism, and like putting it on, this is how it's supposed to be done, right? And one of the things when you would be sitting with a student is, you can't get access there. Why didn't you find the great uncle around the corner who and photograph him and illustrate that? And I can do that. I can go beyond the direct who, what, when, where, why. I can innovate. I can play. It's always this moment of the sort of aha, fearful, I can do that. And it's like, because they're following these outdated rules of photojournalism that even the arguably greatest photojournalists are not necessarily following. And I'm not talking about ethics or clarity of who and how you got an image, but I'm talking about the very classic approaches of Western photojournalism that don't work cookie cutter in every location. That's not how you're going to get access to a story or how you're going to safely tell somebody's story. And so I think it's amazing that the last decade, I'd say the rules are being written by a younger generation of photojournalists and documentary photographers inside the Middle East.
Could you talk a little bit also about the ethics of your practice and what that looks like?
There's some basic guidelines. I think that when you're doing ethical work, the community whose story you're telling, they should recognize themselves. You should invest time before picking up your camera. I really see photography as an intellectual practice, and it needs to be. I think that you need to talk to the stakeholders in the community. You need to understand, if you photograph something, how that can be received and how that can affect the community. You need to go into the nitty-gritty. So you need to talk to various stakeholders. I will always interview the various reps of intelligentsia in a community, and I read very carefully before I go to any location. But then you don't just talk to the intelligentsia, because they might even be out of touch in their own community, right? So you just speak with various stakeholders, and then you look historically at how images, what role they've played. And in Palestine, you think about just the countless images that have been told. I mean, how many horrific images of dead children, for example. I analyzed the impact of images past, how stories have been told in the past. Did it make an impact in understanding or shifting anything to do with rights, with laws, with dialogues around it? And if it didn't, okay, or if, as sadly sometimes it's actually harmful. And then sometimes you're in a situation where something comes up. Oh, well, do I take the picture? I haven't ascertained all of this. And I'm like, yeah. If there is something happening, take the picture. That doesn't mean that the picture should be shared with. You have the power and the responsibility of that archive. I don't think you shouldn't take the picture. Sometimes if there is something happening, take it and then carefully carry that close to you and unpack where it should go, if it should go, right? It's constant, and I have, I've been working for almost 20 years in Palestine. So it's my children's father, my children, they're Palestinian. And I grew up with Palestine on the doorstep in Jordan and that narrative. So it's just, that is a bit intuitive to me, because I'm connected to the community. I've been documenting that community for various communities of Palestine for again, almost 2 decades. So it's intuitive somewhat, although even then you still need to check yourself. But because I'm not, no matter what, no matter how connected, I'm not Palestinian, right? So I'm always aware of that. I say privilege. I mean, that was hell on earth remaining there and fighting and going through the same Let Me Shamil process. But I am not Palestinian at the end of the day. I have an American passport. I have a place to go. So I also analyze that as there are things that I can talk about that some Palestinians are afraid to talk about that's happening because they're afraid of bringing attention on themselves, to lose an ID or to lose. So it's like this, you don't want to, I'm not Palestinian. I am connected to the community. There's a difference. I'm going to be involved in ethical representation and storytelling, and I am going to push things out, even as simply on my social media. I know that sounds like social media, whatever, maybe it's problematic maybe it's played a denigrating role in documentary photography somewhat. There's some negatives to social media. But when it comes to Palestine, social media and Instagram, ironically, this meta-controlled device that would shadow ban. I was shadow banned countless times, and Palestinians in Gaza shadow banned. But the role of Instagram has been this powerful role of getting images out that many Western legacy wouldn't, of maintaining their own narrative and framing. And that's been a powerful tool. And, there's some key players, Bisan, Mortaz Aziza, just countless Palestinians in Gaza whose Instagram has played this crucial role. My last story that I did for the Wall Street Journal. It was before I left. And of course, I knew I was leaving, and I was emotional about that. And I just wanted there to be, and so here's the thing, is the Wall Street Journal hired me as the primary photographer after October 7th. And I think that was a decision in and of itself, because I was having to primarily tell the stories inside Israel. And when we would push the occupied West Bank. But most of the stories I was having to tell were inside Israel. And that was surreal in and of itself. And then also in and of itself, there were times that I'm alone with a mother whose daughter, had been kidnapped and was in Gaza, and then her sobbing and me hugging her, because she'd been doing an array of interviews back to back to back. And I had arrived for my slot at like 10 o'clock at night, where she was almost broken. And this woman is sobbing, and I'm hugging her. And I will hug. So that's an ethical difference. I will hug. I will bring tea and shampoo to a community, especially if it's a community that I'm documenting long form. And they're always giving us, that's the thing about the Middle East, is that it's a very strange irony, especially in Palestinian living rooms, is they will open up their homes, tell you their saddest tale that they're not even fully, sometimes they haven't even processed. And then they will serve you tea, and then bring you coffee, and then bring you dates, and then bring you and slice you fruits, and then look nervously at the reporter's notebook as they're jotting down their stories, which I'm starting to realize as I've come to that makes people nervous. Are they telling it good enough? Is it, there's a nervousness. And once I started thinking about that when I got here, I thought about the eyes that would nervously look at the reporter's notebook. And there's something very peculiar about that. And I'm not shitting on journalism, because it's limited, the resources we have to get these stories. But every single day was an ethical consideration. I felt for the first time I had resources with the newspaper that I'd never had. Of course, that comes with restraints as well. I wasn't allowed to go and do a lot of the stories that I wanted in the West Bank because of safety. I had to get security clearances. But there were days that day by day an ethical consideration would come. And it was I was offered a slot to embed with the Israeli army and go to Gaza. And I knew, I was like, no, I will not do that. And even at the risk of losing this job that was hard to come by. Because again, as I mentioned, economically, it's been hard for documentary photographers. And I said, no. I gave a case for it. I said, you've blocked international journalism. You're not letting international journalists in. You're targeting Palestinian journalists on the ground. And you're going to go in and have the view that the Israeli army gives you, like that. All of those factors were problematic. And not only that, but then I also came forward with, there was a big, in the New York Times, there was a big photo essay, but it was like ruins bathed in that golden hour light. And I just thought, okay, well, what added value, to ignore those very valid ethical considerations, there has to be a reason. You're getting access when you're seeing something. There has to be a reason to justify going and embedding. And I'm not anti-embed. I think some great work came in Iraq with that in Afghanistan. But in this particular case, those factors. And I just didn't think that it, and luckily the editor stood beside me and I didn't have to go. So sorry, I jumped from the ethics question, but it's an incredibly important one that informs every aspect of my work. And it's just, yeah.
You did mention earlier something that I just wanted to pick up on, which was something about the ethical responsibility to be there. I imagine that's something that people who are either photojournalists or documentary photographers, but especially people like yourself who are focused on, geopolitical events, I imagine that's something that they grapple with as well. So I wonder if you have any words of wisdom on that.
It's an interesting question because there's there's the photographers that are working, I would say, at an elevated level with responsibility in connection to communities. Then there's the sort of superstar photojournalists that have consistently access of resources to go. And maybe they're not connected to the communities, but they have these resources and they do a good job. Then there's this other phenomenon. I remember a few photographers reaching out to me after October 7th. I taught them in Europe, in various European locations, and they just wanted to make it. There is something off-putting about parachuting in without a clear story or a connection, or just because that's the hot spot and that's where you're going to make it. There's something off-putting about that. And there's something off-putting about parachute journalism in general. On the other hand, I think that it's gone too far, the critique. I don't think that you have to be from the community. You're the only one that can tell that story. That's not what I'm saying. But I think that there's responsibility and involvement. And I think that when there's conflict and overt pain, it's just you're alive because every single one of you have to be hyper aware, every tentacle of your being. And then when you're out of it, it's a humbling reminder of, well, yeah, that story goes on and you're just another photographer, and you need to not be deluded that you being there is going to change anything. You have to humbly remind yourself that the people that are experiencing said reality, you're just a peon. You don't need to be there, A, but B, I think that the desire, that's it. I think it's just who you are. And I'm wired to want to bring a degree of anthropology and research. And I am wired because I also witnessed firsthand over decades how my work has been altered by a word in a headline or a direction, an editorial direction that didn't make sense. And so I feel like I always looked at it as, when I teach my students, I tell them, you make sure, and I cynically call it the basic bitch edit. I'm like, make sure you get the basic bitch edit, who, what, when, where, why, and the classic imagery that, if you're on assignment, have that. I said, but then have the box that's for you. The box being the housing, the virtual digital box that houses your images and your documentary work and the work that imagine the book that you're going to make or the exhibit that you're going to have, and you're not going to have any editorial restrictions, and this is the you. And then when you send that work to the editors, I'm like, and I explain to them, I'm like, I always cover my bases, as long as I feel it's ethical, I'm not going to hurt anybody. I'll send the basic bitch edit, but then I will send in my images. And I said, and you'll be surprised that especially there are wonderful editors out there that are thinking in new ways and have a connection to images, that they'll choose from that other box and blend it in and let it, and then that sort of becomes a you.
I guess thinking about, how you have developed your own approach to ethics, like you've named sort of several different ethical considerations or ethical issues that are important to how you frame your work. And I guess I wonder, in terms of like how you developed that, I wonder if there was ever a moment that made you reevaluate maybe your role as a photographer or the actions that you've taken as a photographer or the photography industry and shaped that ethical awareness that you have.
It's a constant evolution. Before I send work out, if it's my personal documentary work, I again will show work to the key stakeholders of communities and see how it's being analyzed. And if the critique is more, If it's not a substantial ethical critique, but a very cosmetic one, no. But if there is any way, shape, or form a significant ethical consideration of safety or misrepresentation, or then I refine it. So it's constant. I do remember the first moment, though, that changed everything for me. It was one of my earliest assignments. It was in Texas for a broadsheet paper, like a free, weekly. And there was this amazing elder journalist named Betty Brink, who had been a civil rights activist. And I was assigned to do a story with her. And I was like, oh my God, this is a dream. This is everything. This is why I got into this. This is what I want to be doing. I'm going to make it, because it just feels there's so much futility getting in, right? And so we went, and the story was this very small Black community between Dallas and Fort Worth that had fallen out of a tax bracket. They weren't being represented. And so there were cases of not having running water. I mean, this was like, we're talking about 2000. It was insane. And so we went into the community, and then Betty liked to work alone. That was a little heartbreaking. But so I was left to my own, finding images separate from Betty directly. And I found an elderly man, a former sheriff officer who knew my maternal grandfather, who was a deputy sheriff, and told me hilarious things about him. Again, the personal is always there in the story. It shouldn't be you're navel gazing and looking for the personal, but if you're open to you're connected. There's so many connections, and it's those connections and being open to the personal and being vulnerable to the personal when you have the gift of telling somebody's personal story. That's a place to be. But then I got to know a single mother, and I went once and sat with her for hours, didn't bring out my camera. That was the first time I intuitively didn't bring out the camera and just talked. And then I went back a second time. Now, this is why documentary work is so hard, is to do it ethically. It's not very effective financially, but it's what it takes to make quality work, and more importantly, ethical work. I went back several times. And then the third time she was like, hey, can you watch my daughter for like 10 minutes while I do load the laundry in the back? And I was like, absolutely. She was this beautiful 2-year-old. And then she came out and she said, okay, I know you're a photographer. You want an image, right? I was like, I would love one. She said, okay, let's do it. Where do you want me? And I wasn't expecting it. And I was a very young photographer at the time. So I just said, let's just go to the front of the house. And she happened to be barefoot because she was in her house. Like, we're all barefoot in our house, right? And so she walked outside and had the baby on her hip. And I took several steps back, and I was going to take a wide shot of the clapboard house and a mother with a child. And I was excited because I think in my mind, I was thinking FSA, Dorothea Lange, like I was sort of, this is what a great photograph is, and I'm making one. And then she tilted her head and said, hey, please don't make me look like a ghetto mother. Like, is that what you're doing? And I paused and I thought for a moment, and not intentionally what I was doing, but yeah, that's what was being done. And so I didn't know how to remedy the moment other than I just got very, very, very close. And, we were photographing on Tri-X then, and I got very, very close, and we just kind of were a bit playful and joking around. And then she picked up her daughter and she was kissing her. I had just all of these intimate photographs of her with her daughter. And I developed them and rushed back to the paper. And I thought, oh, I'm fucked, man. They're not gonna. And they ended up, I got the cover and I got a double spread. And the double spread was this wonderful one of her holding her daughter up and leaning forward to kiss her, And that was a moment where I understood that you could do the right thing. You could be responsible, but that's okay, that you're not pushed out, that there's a place for that responsibility. And I remember I brought 10 copies to her, and her joy at seeing that. So that was kind of an early lesson on. And then in recent years, it's a constant reevaluation that you have to always consider. Like, I was on a Nat Geo assignment in Morocco, in Marrakesh, to photograph, how do you pronounce them, macaques? And that should have been a dream assignment, but it wasn't. It was one of the most hellacious assignments I ever did, because there's only a few men that have the right, that have the license to have them. And it's kind of like a bit gang behavior and very aggressive. And if somebody glances at, if somebody takes a selfie while they're walking by, they're going to be surrounded. Anyway, all of these things and the considerations. But when the text came out with the images, because I'd gotten to know some of the men that were working under these gangs, they weren't making the money. They were just sort of low on the totem pole holding the monkey. When the first draft came out, it was very much the monkeys, the monkeys, the monkeys. But what I had learned through these days of was the amount of poverty and lack of options that these men who were working had. And I was like, could you just add a little bit of nuance there? Could you? So it's just a constant evaluation of the story that you're in, I guess.
Absolutely. No, I think those are really, really useful examples. Is there anything that I should have asked you but didn't?
Maybe the construction of stories. When a story becomes a full-fledged project dedication, that evolution. Yeah, I think that when you're in a long form project, that's the greatest. When you're working on a long form project, that gives you the time and consideration to reflect, to check with stakeholders, to reassess, rephotograph, edit out, find new ways around. I like to work in what I call the murky middle. Like I'm a documentary photographer, but I'll borrow from theater, I'll borrow from psychology, any element to find a way of illustrating a story. I think of myself almost more as an anthropologist, and the image is a sort of perfectly, potently strong symbol of that story, right? Like a good photograph will carry a punch. It's like a Raymond Carver short story. It's like, it's incredibly strong, but it's like that one image is, there's so much work around gathering it. And all of the work that goes into getting that trusted image that conveys everything that you're hoping that it does. It's about testimony, ultimately. Like for me, I will, like the work that I did with Syrian refugees not in camps in Jordan that were housed in places that were called homes for widows of Syrian fighters. Like 99% of the time, they didn't want their image taken. They were afraid. They're not in their community. There's a million reasons why. And that's, of course, their right. But they were opening up and telling their stories, the pain of having lost their husband, what choices had been made to flee, to live in this dank 2-room apartment in fear. And they were opening up, and these testimonies were unbelievable that were gathered. They were unbelievable stories, so strong, so important, that needed to be told. I just thought to myself, that's the most important thing is the testimony. And I think that that's what leads my photography. And then just as much as any other photographer, I love a beautiful image, don't get me wrong. And sometimes you are lucky and you can just move into that. But sometimes you're in a very delicate ecosystem where taking an image isn't easily done. And I think that if you're getting a testimony, it's worth writing it out. Again, not the economic choice. It's why I think documentary photographers are poor often. But in the end, we found a way. We opened up because there was a degree of trust and the realization that the children, they felt safe being photographed, and these curtains that were always shut, these rooms with halogen lights and this dim misery, and then the curtains shut even though they wanted light, but because of fear, the outside coming in, we ended up using all of this to our advantage. Those curtains that were shut became theatrical curtains, and the children performed a lot of the stories that they told. And I'm just saying that I think that there is always a way. And I think that the most important thing is that we're trying to convey a story. It's not just about a beautiful image. An image should carry a lot. It's a potent symbol. And quite often I will take on those stories that should be told. You're like, holy shit. Palestinian prisoners are having to smuggle their sperm in candy wrappers and on dry dates. And there's over 130 children born from this process. And wow, to what degree what extremes are people having to go to have their most basic right to life? And, I'm not going to get access to the Israeli prisons. And I'm not going to get access to the moment of the handoff of the chocolate to the IVF. I'm not going to get access to those things, but it's an important story to be told. And I think we have a responsibility to try to innovate in our image making and to be as layered and nuanced as possible.
And the last question that I like to ask everyone is, what does photography ethics mean to you? Or what does it mean to be an ethical photographer?
If you're an ethical photographer, and even when you're an ethical photographer, you're going to have your doubts because quite often you are working in communities that are not your own. But even if they are your own, you're working in communities that are undergoing trauma, stress, violence, oppression. How you tell that story could hurt them, could bring attention, such as in the case of Palestine. If it gets too much attention, there might be retribution from the army, from the state. Do you hide their face? Do you this? Do you that? If they're willing to tell you their story and be photographed because they're in a moment of emotional outrage, but you know that there could be retribution, do you put that image out? It's just constant evaluation and reevaluation. And again, always speaking to stakeholders within the community to assess that. So it's a process of being thoughtful, evolved, emotionally intelligent human being and understanding that this is not a right. You work very hard to get access. And you can tell there's a difference between a parachute journo drop-in snapshot. You can tell when you've been invited in to the house and that there's a degree of trust. It's very clear in the image and what's reflected. It's just a constant evaluation, checking in with stakeholders. And there's no key formula. You also end up developing an intuition as you go and trusting. That's another thing, is trusting your intuition.
Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Photo Ethics Podcast. The aim of this podcast is to share new insights about photography ethics with others. So if you heard something you liked, please share this podcast with someone who would appreciate it. You can also rate and review us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. This episode of the Photo Ethics Podcast is sponsored by Falmouth University, one of the UK's leading creative arts universities. In a world where images shape narratives, ethical photography has never been more important. At Falmouth University, the online photography MA helps you master your craft while exploring the responsibilities of visual storytelling. Learn from industry experts, challenge conventions, and develop work with integrity, all from almost anywhere in the world. Join a global community of photographers committed to making a difference. Search Falmouth online and book a call with a course advisor today. This is the final episode in Season 6 of the Photo Ethics Podcast. You can stay connected with us online at www.photoethics.org or by following us on social media. We're on Blue Sky and X, formerly known as Twitter, at PhotoEthics, and on Instagram at PhotoEthics Center. Thanks very much for joining me throughout Season 6.